Change management. We're going to start by looking at change management in the context of process. The process is a set of interrelated actions and activities performed to achieve a specific product, result, or outcome. When properly applied, the change management process increases the likelihood that individuals and organizations effectively transition to a future state to achieve expected benefits. Individuals and stakeholders need information, leadership support, training, coaching, rewards, reinforcement, and time to decide whether to engage in a change and to what degree. Transition from current to future state is achieved by applying change management processes so that stakeholders can engage before, during, and after the change process. Effective change management results when the perceived negative impacts and risks of the change are minimized, and the overall expected benefits are achieved ideally within the budget and schedule. While there's often an overall change management flow, process groups are associations of similar or related processes that serve as guides for the application of change management knowledge, skills, and abilities during change management implementation. These groups are linked in that the output, a result of one process, becomes the input of another process. Processes within each group are iterative, sometimes simultaneously, and may be applied multiple times through the change management effort. Change initiatives may employ various approaches, such as waterfall or agile. Change management processes, given their iterative and sometimes simultaneously nature, should be properly adapted for effectiveness, regardless of the project management methodology employed. The process of change management described in this document draws on many existing change management methodologies and identifies generally accepted practices rather than replicating a particular methodology. Practitioners using a particular methodology will find commonalities and perhaps additional suggestions for extending their change management efforts. As an emerging discipline, the ACMP standard does not mandate particular activities or process steps. Consequently, those familiar with the language of standards will not be surprised at the absence of the word shall in describing the processes. Instead, the language describes generally accepted practice. Therefore, processes, their sub-processes, and actions are generally used but not required. The following process groups are used to organize and elaborate on the processes performed by change management practitioners during the change initiative. We'll be exploring these further as we go throughout this video. First, evaluate change impact and organizational readiness. Second, formulate the change management strategy. Third, develop the change management plan. Fourth, execute the change management plan. And fifth, complete the change management plan. We're going to start by looking at evaluating change impact and organizational readiness. The purpose of evaluating change impact and organizational readiness is to review the overall change and how it will impact the organization, and also to establish whether the organization is ready and able to adopt the proposed change. This comprehensive evaluation involves a series of processes. Each process outlines the purpose of the activity, main area of focus, and key inputs and outputs. These processes are closely linked to the order in which they are typically performed. The following list outlines the goals of the evaluation process with respect to change effects and organizational readiness. First, define the change and why it must occur. Develop and communicate a clear vision of the future state. Determine the key stakeholders involved and who will be affected by the change. Assess the organization's culture, capacity, and readiness for change. Assess whether change leaders understand and are committed to a change program. Assess the risks and likelihood of success to identify potential actions that promote progress towards change. The evaluation of effects and readiness for change should begin before formulating change management strategies and plans. Each process output should be the product of wide and proactive consultation to close the gap between the strategic intent, formulation of strategies and plans that will achieve the expected benefit. First, defining the change. The purpose of defining the change is to discern and specify the change that the organization intends to adopt to meet a strategic objective. Fundamental questions around the change, the purpose, who will be impacted and how, and alignment of the change with organizational goals and needs are key to defining the change. Questions may include, will the change be departmental or enterprise-wide? Will the change be people, process, or technology-oriented? Is the change part of or in conjunction with other changes happening in the organization? Will the change be considered transformational or incremental? And how will the organization and its structure be affected by the change? clearly defined change is needed to determine the approach necessary to implement the change successfully. Inputs include the business case, research, charter, strategic plan, and success measures. Outputs are typically change definition and charter. Next, determine why the change is required. This is used to explain the current opportunity, risks, or consequences, and benefits. This process develops the case for change to support the organization's vision and clearly articulates its expected benefits to the organization. It should include a clear description of the consequences of not changing. It may identify risks associated with a lack of commitment or resistance if the change lacks a compelling reason, is considered unnecessary by stakeholders. Misunderstood or incomplete change rationale may be one of the biggest risks in successfully gaining stakeholder adoption. Inputs include business case, change definition, charter, strategic plan, success measures. Outputs are commonly business case and charter. Next, develop a clear vision of the future state. This is used to facilitate the development of the organization's operating state after the change has been adopted. The process includes focusing on developing and describing a common direction for the future state so that stakeholders can envision it in operation and foresee the value of the future state. Inputs include the organization vision, mission, and values, the business case, the change definition, and strategic plan. Outputs will include the vision statement. Next, we'll identify goals, objectives, and success criteria. These are used to provide tangible, concrete, measurable, and manageable goals that represent planned progress towards the adoption of the future state. This process directs focus to actual change results and anticipated outcomes rather than tracking the change process. It should establish key change objectives and goals that define progress toward the change. The process should also describe the key parameters that measure when goals and objectives are attained, which will enable the associated success criteria to be identified. Inputs include the business case, charter, strategic plan, vision statement, and change definition. Outputs include change objectives and goals, success criteria, and measures. Next, we'll identify sponsors accountable for the change. This is meant so that we can connect the change to its owners and determine accountability requirements. The process identifies the sponsors accountable for the change and assesses their alignment with and commitment to the change. It may involve completing a role analysis to differentiate accountable individuals and groups from those who are responsible. Those accountable are required to bring the change to completion, whereas those responsible are operationally required to do the day-to-day work of driving the change to achieve its goals and objectives. As in 5.1.6, identify stakeholders affected by the change, this process should capture information related to motivations, abilities, expectations, and concerns regarding the change. This information can be captured through a variety of methods, such as structured interviews and general discussions to identify potential constraints, conflicts, or concerns. Inputs include change definition, charter, stakeholder analysis, current organizational charts and profiles. Outputs are commonly sponsor identification and sponsor assessment. Next, we'll identify stakeholders affected by the change. This is meant so that we can identify stakeholder attributes such as level of influence, commitment, or rules, and determine the size, scope, and complexity of the change impact on key individuals and groups. This process identifies those affected by the change and those with the ability to influence the outcome. The process also establishes roles within the change initiative and may identify individuals or groups in multiple roles. The process should group stakeholders to facilitate organizational and individual change activities. A comprehensive stakeholder analysis is used in the development of the change management strategy. It is also used to prepare stakeholder engagement, communication, and learning development plans. This process should capture information regarding motivations, expectations, concerns, and attitudes towards the change. The information can be captured through a variety of methods, such as structured interviews, general discussions, and questionnaires. Inputs include change definition, vision statement, current organizational charts and profiles, research, and charter. Outputs include a stakeholder analysis. The next step would be to assess the change. The purpose is to analyze how stakeholders will be impacted by the change and the change's specific impact on people, processes, tools, organizational structure, roles, and technology. This process involves identifying, categorizing who and what will be affected, assessing the degree of change occurring within these areas, and describing the change. This process determines the size, scope, timing, and complexity of the change effort. It is used to inform and guide the formation of the change strategy and identify activities required to manage risk and resistance that may be associated with change. Inputs include change definition, vision statement, research, stakeholder analysis. Outputs include change impact assessment. Next, you'll assess the alignment of the change with the organization's strategic objectives and performance measurements. The purpose is to anticipate the impact of the expected benefits on the organization's strategic goals and objectives. The process assesses where alignment and misalignment of objectives, targets, results, and performance measures occur between the future and the current state. This is achieved by conducting a review of strategy with the relevant entities and individuals, such as those at the executive level, strategic planning office, change management office, and project or program management office. Strategic planning instruments such as balanced scorecards, strategic plans, and roadmaps should be evaluated and contrasted against the change being proposed. Change management practitioners are responsible for driving appropriate actions to overcome obstacles and avoid or minimize adverse effects. The process identifies potential change obstacles and conflicts as well as opportunities to manage or address them. The process will produce one of four results. It will confirm that change and strategy are in alignment, adapt in the strategy if change is deemed necessary but is insufficiently aligned with current strategy, postponing change until it is more aligned to organizational strategy, or canceling the change outright. The result impacts the outputs produced or modified. Inputs include the strategic plan, current vision statement, future state vision statement, case for change, risk plan. Outputs include organizational alignment assessment, modifications to organizational and enterprise performance targets, modifications to strategic plan, modification of business case, and modification of vision statement. As noted previously, the result of this stage may confirm that change in strategy or in alignment. Adapt may mean that you have to adapt your strategy if change is deemed necessary but is insufficiently aligned with the current strategy. Postpone change until it is more aligned to the organizational strategy, or cancel the change outright. Next, we will look at assessing the external factors that may affect organizational change. The purpose of doing this is to identify the customer, market, social, legal, economic, political, technological, and other factors outside the organization that may influence stakeholder adoption of the future state. This process is used to determine external factors that will enable or constrain the change effort and identify how those forces will influence the change approach. This is an iterative process because the external environment can introduce new risks or opportunities that can affect the change outcomes. This process is used to guide and inform the development of the change management strategy. Inputs include business case, vision statement, strategic plan. Outputs include some form of external environmental impact assessment. Next, we'll assess the organization's culture as it's related to change. This is meant to determine the cultural elements within the organization that may help or hinder the change direction and achievement of expected benefits. Organizational culture is defined as the shared values of and behaviors uniquely common to an organization. Organizational culture is integral in determining how tasks are completed, the way people interact with one another, the language they use when communicating, and the attitudes, goals, values, and leadership behaviors that are exhibited. This process determines if the organization's current culture, structure, process, and performance management system will support the change. If so, then the process will investigate how the current culture can be managed through the change. If the current culture will not support the change, then the process identifies the aspects of the current culture requiring change in order to realize the future state. Indicators that a cultural change may be necessary to support and sustain the change include current culture does not allow the stakeholders to work in ways that support the future state. Current culture does not support the planned organizational processes or behavioral change. Current values are in conflict with what will be expected of the stakeholders and leaders. The process focuses on the tangible cultural elements that regularly occur in an organization, the intangible elements which are unwritten or unspoken beliefs and behaviors that may not be overt. The process identifies where cultural consistencies or compatibilities exist. The culture assessment is used to guide and inform the development of the change management strategy. The culture assessment findings can be used to anticipate and avoid roadblocks. Inputs include core values and behaviors, current communication channels, tools and methods, opinion surveys and feedback assessments, and vision statements. Next, we'll assess the organizational capacity for change. The purpose of assessing the organizational capacity for change is to determine the ability of the various stakeholders impacted by the change to adopt the change and move towards a future state. The capacity of an organization to adopt new changes is dependent on a variety of internal and external factors, including the organization's operational ability to absorb change, volume of concurrent changes currently occurring and planned, ability to absorb additional change, historical experience with change, including changes perceived as positive and negative, change maturity, which is the extent to which the organization uses change, project management methodologies, techniques, and tools, economic, environmental, and political stability, external and internal. There are many factors, many methods and tools available to help the change management practitioner measure these factors, including performing a cultural assessment, reviewing change and project management maturity audits, audit lessons learned and change in project and portfolio reports to gauge an organization's current and planned changes and past record of adopting changes of similar magnitude, review independent reports on external and internal factors including economy, environment, and political conditions. The required behavioral changes, skill sets, competencies, and potential barriers to change may be identified, for example, by collaborating with leadership, line managers, human resources, and employees. These steps should be considered the prerequisites for successful change because they will outline the minimum capacity the organization needs to achieve the proposed change. Inputs include competency assessment, culture assessment, organization's historical experience with change, stakeholder assessment, external environmental impact assessment, change impact assessment, and inventory of change-related resources. Outputs include organizational change capacity assessment. Next, we'll look at the assessment for organizational readiness for change. The purpose of this is to determine the organization's preparedness for change activities. This process assesses the preparedness of the conditions, attitudes, and resources needed for a change to happen successfully. This process should include organizational readiness elements such as market factors, capacity, and saturation, which address key characteristics and attributes of the organization to propose change. This process should also focus on assessing the organization's level of comprehension, perceptions, and expectations of the change. It should identify gaps existing between the change leader's own skills, expectations, and attitudes and the collective view of the organization. It should also assess the organizational process changes and determine a level of understanding and preparation of the organizational units for the transition. This process is used to develop action plans if major weaknesses in the organization's readiness are identified. Inputs include change objectives and goals, cultural assessment, organizational change capacity assessment, organizational alignment assessment, sponsorship alignment assessment, vision statement, and risk assessment. Outputs include organizational change readiness assessment. Next, we will assess communication needs, communication channels, and the ability to deliver the key messages. The purpose of this is to determine the communication effort required to support the transition to the future state. This process is used to define the communication needs of all stakeholders and focus on the specific communication needs of individuals or groups of stakeholders. The communication needs assessment is used to develop the communication strategy to prepare resource and budget estimates. It is also used to identify risks that may directly affect communication effectiveness and progress towards change. Inputs includes change objectives and goals, cultural assessment, organizational change capacity assessment, sponsorship alignment assessment, stakeholder analysis, current communication channels, tools, and methods, vision statement, and risk assessment. Outputs includes a communication needs assessment. Next, we will assess learning capabilities. This is meant to determine the scale, magnitude, and complexity of the learning and development needed to ensure that the future state is successfully achieved. The learning needs assessment determines what stakeholders need to do differently and what will demonstrate the need for new competencies, capabilities, knowledge, skills, techniques, and behaviors required to successfully perform and sustain in the future state operations. It focuses on the future technical, social, and behavioral skills and abilities required. The process should determine the need for learning equipment, educators, and logistics. It should also identify key constraints or barriers that may affect the learning program's success. The process will determine the learning strategies and approaches and the need for learning equipment, educators, and logistics. It should also identify key constraints or barriers that may affect the learning program's success. The learning needs assessment is used to develop the learning and development strategy. It is also used to prepare resource and budget estimates and performance metrics. Inputs include stakeholder analysis, change impact assessment, communication needs assessment, cultural assessment, organizational change capacity assessment, and organizational alignment assessment. Outputs include learning needs assessment. Finally, we'll conduct a change risks assessment. The purpose of conducting a change risk assessment is to determine and anticipate the identifiable risks to the proposed change. These may be risks commonly associated with change, such as resistance of the stakeholders or lack of visible sponsorship from the leadership of the organization. But other possible risks that may affect the change should be considered. For example, the risk assessment might show a significant risk to successful implementation of the change unless certain stakeholders' roles change. The assessment should include a level of measuring the impact of the identified risks on a change. For example, whether a project would be completely halted should a risk become a reality. Inputs include stakeholder analysis, change impact assessment, culture assessment, organizational change capacity assessment. Outputs include change risks assessment and risk register. This is the flow diagram that we looked at earlier for change management process. Thank you.